king's sharp sword lies clean and bright, prepared in foreign lands to fight. Our ravens croak to have their fill, the wolf howls from the distant hill. The forest-dwelling peasantry glimpsed that feared man. Here was the exiled King Olaf, returned from the land of the Rus to take back the throne of Norway. At his side was his half-brother, the strong Harald Sigurdsson, 15 years of age. On the path, vagabonds joined their army, and this force settled on a small hill at a place called Stiklestad. And at once they perceived the clamor of another army, led by a man who once served Olaf, Kulf Arnason. He now marched on behalf of the usurper king Canute the Great, who ruled over Denmark, England, and this kingdom of Norway. Men howled summons to Christ, others to Odin, and the two armies fell upon each other in fury. Olaf's position was overrun. Stray limbs and corpses trailed slick upon the hill. An enemy stabbed young Harald, and King Olaf was impaled. And so recorded the Norse lore. King Olaf fell upon a stone, and he called out to God as he clutched at the spear which quivered in his abdomen. And he looked up to see Kulf Arnason, who duly cut Olaf's throat. Soldiers scattered. Kulf and his men stalked the body hills, killing the wounded. The bleeding Harald gathered to his feet and stole into the wilderness, staggering through the thick until he came to a hovel. Therein a kindly peasant family received him and tended to his wounds by firelight. Harald healed there for some days, but he could not tarry, for the black winter would soon turn the woods bitter and block the high passes east. So Harald wrapped himself in a red cloak, and the peasant's son showed him the way into the mountains. Straying from the main roads, the intrepid prince wandered over quiet peaks, and avoiding bandit hideouts, he passed into old and heathen woods, where legends said lived giants and trolls. Harald came finally to Sweden, and finding other survivors from Stiklestad, he wintered there, rallied some strong allies, and departed Scandinavia. Harald and his warriors passed in dragon ships before quiet wooden towns and humble cathedrals. Their forebears had once come to this land of the Rus to slaughter and plunder, for the age of the Viking had begun 2 centuries before. Norse chiefs had gathered the bravest sons of Odin to burn, loot, and enslave all the coasts of Europe. But here the Norse had also settled, and along with local Slavs and Finnic peoples, they established a vast state called the Kievan Rus. In Scandinavia, too, the days of the old gods and petty clans were waning. Men like Olaf and Canute had made Christian kings of themselves and brought war against those fractious heathen chieftains. And yet Odin's raven flew still on the royal banners, and the cruel axes of Norsemen were feared in every realm. Thus, Harald and his men endeavored here to become mercenaries. Passing through the lofty gates of Novgorod or Kiev, Harald came to the court of the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, to whom he relayed sorrowful word of Olaf's demise. For it was Yaroslav who had provided sanctuary for Olaf in his exile, and still present in this court were Olaf's mistress and his illegitimate son, Magnus. Yaroslav welcomed Harald and sent the prince and his warriors first into the boglands of Poland, where they slew enemy Poles and destroyed their dwellings. In this manner, Harald sharpened his axe against the prince's enemies for years, earning glory and blood money as he went. He finally proposed that Yaroslav betroth him to his child daughter, the Kievan princess Elisaveta, but Yaroslav refused. For Harald, at roughly 18 years of age, remained a brave but crownless leader among the king's officers, and he possessed neither land nor riches. In 1034, 2 Norwegians arrived in Kievan Rus, bitter enemies of the late Olaf, the corpulent Einar Thumbar-Skelfir, and Kulf Arneson. King Canute was being overthrown in Norway, and they had come to collect a suitable successor, not Harald so strong of will, but the impressionable child Magnus. Harald did not possess the men nor the riches to challenge all these enemies, to take the throne he so desired. Yet he had heard of distant lands filled with fabled treasures to be won in glorious battles. And so Harald gathered a few hundred men and sailed far south. The sun shone white against heavenward crosses and fell smoothly down the domes and aqueducts, scattering into shadows against houses and canopied streets. When Rome fell to the barbarians in the times of old and the western glory waned, it was this city that kept alight the flame of that ancient empire. This was Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Harald pushed through the city. Magnificent forums clattered with the wares of merchants from afar, and there were foul streets lined by groaning beggars and brothels. Harald approached the palace and enlisted in the Varangian Guard, the ranks of storied Norse mercenaries prized by these Byzantines as loyal bodyguards and elite infantry. It was Varangians who guarded the throne, where sat Emperor Michael IV, and by his side the fair Empress Zoe, more than 30 years his senior. Only months before, Michael had been merely the low-born lover of the Empress. It was widely believed that the pair orchestrated the murder of her husband, Emperor Romanus III. They married the very day he died. Harald and his men were welcomed here, for a grave threat afflicted this empire. The Islamic Fatimid Caliphate ruled the Holy Land and much of the southern Mediterranean, and of late thousands of Muslim corsairs from Islamic Sicily and Tunisia began to assail the shores of Christendom, raiding villages, killing the men, and stealing women and children into slavery. To those burning coasts the emperor now sent his fleet. Byzantine ships careened after the pirates and unleashed howling streams of Greek fire. Some of the pirates perished in the infernal winds. Others would have raised their swords in defense, only to be met by the rageful Harald and his Vikings grappling aboard with two-handed axes. They annihilated the pirates on the ships they captured, and joined the Byzantine land campaign to brutally conquer and subjugate Muslim-held towns along the imperial borders. The Fatimids responded with equal force, massacring and enslaving Christian towns, and then they brokered peace with Michael IV. Their terms permitted Christians to rebuild the sacred Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, destroyed by the Fatimids a few decades before when their caliph had, for a time, forced Christians to convert to Islam. It was written that Harald joined the imperial delegation on a long and arid journey across the desert, until at last they beheld the Holy Land. The Byzantines toured the hallowed shrines of Jerusalem, walked the pilgrim-trodden path of the crucifixion. Harald made use of his axe butchering bandits who stalked their caravan, and later stopped to bathe in the River Jordan. Now in his 20s, Harald came to command the Varangians with stern ferocity. He joined the Byzantine invasion of Islamic Sicily and was said to have ended a siege by tunneling under the walls of a city with his Varangians and slaying the garrison. In all his conquests he plundered greedily and amassed a hoard of foreign treasure, but all was not well in this empire. Prayers rang out in the gilded churches of Constantinople. Dark days lay ahead. All could see the emperor was ailing, his flesh swelled, and he was beset by violent seizures. He adopted his nephew Michael as his son and named him as his successor. Some were wary of the younger Michael. One monk recalled, "He concealed a wicked nature under a benign front. He was adept at scheming and plotting." Yet the Emperor still lived, and he summoned Harald to claim some final glory at his side and crush a revolt among the Bulgars. And so together they laid waste to the rebel towns, capturing a rebel king who had had his eyes plucked and nose cut off, and they returned to Constantinople in a victorious procession. Harald was hailed as the brave burner of the Bulgars, while the pallid, sickly emperor wavered on his horse. He died soon after. His adopted son was crowned Emperor Michael V, and the Golden Court became a corrupt garden of sycophants, possessed by the paranoia of the emperor. Michael sent men to attack Harald, but he and the Varangians killed the imperial assassins. Neither did Michael V trust Zoe. In truth, he had once thought to make a bride of his adoptive mother, but she was now over 60 and could bear him no heir. He had Zoe arrested, hastily convicted of attempting to poison him, and it was written, he dared to cut the hair off Zoe as though she was a common whore, and to banish her to an island in chains, where she was forced to become a nun. The people were outraged. Mobs formed at the feet of pillared palaces. Michael V brooded in his quarters, tormented by their shouts of derision, their love of Zoe. He arranged for the return of the former empress, and forced the captive Zoe to implore the crowds to accept him as their emperor. The people were not swayed by this gesture. Crowds stormed the palace, and Harald and his men joined the rebellion. They cut down the palace guards, overran the royal quarters, and the mobs looted the gold, fine tapestries, and silk therein. Emperor Michael was found cowering in a monastery, pleading that he had relinquished the throne and taken monastic vows. The people dragged him from the altar to the walls of Constantinople. And there the Norse sagas recorded it was Harald of Norway himself who emerged to sate the mob's cries for blood. He pulled up the writhing and hysterical Michael V, and with his dagger he plucked out his eyes. The emperor wailed and bled at the feet of this Viking, and Michael was then said to have been castrated. Then he was banished to a monastery where he died a few months later. In time, the throne would be restored to Zoe. Some believed the empress longed for Harald, and yet Zoe would marry another lover, a man over 20 years her junior. If Harald had washed his blade in the blood of royals, there were yet other kings to slay. For the throne of Norway was sat upon by the bastard son of his dead brother, and counseled by traitors to his house. Harald would have his vengeance. Around the year 1044, as a Yuletide frost crept over the north, King Magnus of Norway brought fire and death to Denmark. Thralls abandoned the burning halls of their fallen masters. Men were slain before their kin, their wives and children carried away as plunder. The invaders sought the rebel Jarl called Svein, for the Danes had raised him as their sovereign king to supplant the foreign rule of King Magnus. Upon the death of Canute the Great and later Canute's son, King Magnus had inherited a claim to the thrones of England and Denmark, and though he would not insist on pursuing the former, his reign over the latter was now recognized in blood and ash. Svein's warriors lay scattered throughout the land, drifting dead in the cold tide or crouched in shadowed woods. Svein found refuge at the friendly court of the King of Sweden, and Magnus the Good was hailed as the true and noble king of Norway and Denmark. Talk of post-mortem miracles surrounded his late father, the fervent Christian King Olaf, revered now as a saint. So great were the armies of Magnus, so holy his claim to the throne, that there seemed none left in all the land to oppose him. A gale howled over the seas, waves swelled before a stranger ship. Here sailed the bane of great kings, a Viking long ago banished from this land, uncle to Magnus, brother to Saint Olaf. This was the mercenary Harald Sigurdsson, returned to take the crown of Norway. He sojourned at the Swedish court, and there he unloaded strange and innumerable treasures. For roughly 15 years had passed since he fled Scandinavia from that battlefield where his brother Olaf fell, and he had since won glory and riches in the land of the Rus and the Byzantine Empire as the hired champion of princes and emperors. That autumn, when Magnus and his men were along the coast, they were struck by the approach of Harald's magnificent ship. King Magnus received his uncle with guarded cordiality. The Grand Prince of Kiev had recently betrothed his fair daughter Elisaveta to Harald, and so it was seen that Harald possessed riches greater than King Magnus himself, a wife of status, and a blood claim to the throne. Harald asked Magnus how he wished to divide the rule of Norway between them. Magnus answered that he was obliged to consult with his advisors on the matter. His chief advisor then stepped forward. This old enemy of Olaf, Einar Thumbarskelfir, chastised Harald. "We are not keen to be divided between two kings. We have always served one king, and so it must remain for as long as King Magnus continues to reign." Harald returned in shame to Sweden. If his enemies would not see him as king, they would suffer him as a warrior. Dragon ships cast onto the shore, and Northmen swept over the land at the command of Svein and Harald. The two men had sworn an oath of allegiance. Together they would seize Denmark for Svein and Norway for Harald. Towns became screaming pyres. They hacked men to death and tore wailing women from lowly huts. And it was said, "Few were they of escape to tell, for sorrow-worn the people fell. The only captives from the fray were lovely maidens led away, and in wild terror to the strand, down to the ships the linked band of fair-haired girls is roughly driven, their soft skins by the irons riven." Tidings of war reached Magnus, and the king's council did not think it wise to oppose Harald, and so messengers passed in secret between Magnus and Harald to negotiate the co-rulership of Norway between them. Svein suspected betrayal. He attempted to assassinate Harald in his sleep, but Harald escaped, and at long last he was crowned King Harald III of Norway. As co-ruler, Magnus insisted on being the primary king, granted precedence in courtly matters and ritual. Magnus was beloved by his people for his leniency and generosity, and for this Harald resented him as weak and childish. The two insulted each other with impunity, but still a greater danger united them. They moved against Svein in Denmark, and there, in the fall of the year 1047, Magnus was said to have been gripped by an illness. With his waning strength, Magnus declared that the sole rule of Norway would pass to Harald, and Denmark given over to Svein. King Magnus the Good then died. Harald did not think himself bound by the wishes of dying kings. At once he made preparations to move with haste against Svein and claim the throne of Denmark. But in the king's assembly, Einar openly declared that he himself would return to bury Magnus in Norway, and that he would rather serve Magnus dead than any other king alive. The fighting men loyal to the chieftain Einar were so numerous and his influence so great that Harald had little choice but to tolerate such treasonous speech and return to assert his rule over Norway. For the high thrones of Scandinavia had not entirely supplanted the power of the Viking halls. Kings were still obliged to reckon with the old war clans of every region. Svein was raised as the king of the Danes, and when Harald went to ravage Denmark in the summer, Svein eluded capture. Harald returned to Norway and married a second wife, Thora of the influential Arneson family. While his wives would bear him children to be raised as heirs to Norway, the king's gaze turned ever south. In 1050, he returned to terrorize Denmark. His Vikings tore over farmland, ruined villages, and burned churches. They tortured people to death, violated women, and burned the trading post of Hedeby. When Svein at last met Harald with a massive army, Harald fled. In Norway, Harald moved to punish and assassinate those who questioned his rule. Yet Einar stood at the head of a mighty faction of chieftains who freely decried the king's butchery. At length, Harald requested a meeting with Einar to resolve the matter. Einar stepped alone into the king's chamber and remarked how dark the room was. A few of Harald's men then emerged from the shadows and killed him. Einar's son rushed in to the aid of his father, and they killed him too. The people came to despise King Harald, and there was wide talk of rebellion among the farmers. The king tasked his ally, Finn Arneson, to entreat them to peace. Finn requested the king offer something in exchange for so dangerous a quest: the safe return of his brother, Kulf. Kulf Arneson was the greatest traitor to Harald's house. He was said to have personally killed Olaf. When Magnus learned of this crime years ago, Kulf fled into exile to the Norwegian domains along the northern edge of Scotland. Harald now welcomed Kulf back to Norway and restored him to his old estates. Then, in the summer, King Harald went on campaign in Denmark and demanded that Kulf make the first assault against the Danish position. Only after Kulf was overrun and killed with his men did Harald land with reinforcements. Finn and all the people saw plainly the treachery of their vengeful king. Harald wrote that he took pride in having given the death stroke to 2 more of his enemies. The king burned and pillaged regions whose fealty wavered, and there were rumors that he stole offerings set by the faithful at the tomb of Saint Olaf. Though he raised great churches and the kingdom outwardly prospered, the people in coming centuries would know him as Hardrada, the hard ruler. For years he shed the blood of so many foes, but still the hated Svein of Denmark remained. Harald commanded 150 longships south, plundering shores which in those days belonged to the Danes. Then, near the mouth of the river Nisa, the men were taken by the sight of a fleet twice their size. Spain had come to answer the king's challenge to war. In this land, the late summer sun lingers long in the sky, and the embers of twilight burn on the horizon even in the darkest hour. In the shadowy haze, Harald stirred his men to battle. Each fleet was lashed together with ropes and chains to hold the lines, and they crashed forward. Arrows and spears were flung into shields, chests, and heads. Untethered Norwegian ships then outflanked the Danes, and a slaughter began on the decks. The Danes threw themselves overboard, and Harald took 70 of their ships. In the sea of gashed bodies, his warriors captured alive Finn Arneson, who had betrayed Harald to serve Svein. Harald decided to spare him. At any rate, King Svein had escaped the battle and regrouped. The 2 kingdoms had been drained by war, and within 2 years, Harald brokered unconditional peace with Svein. Harald would remain in Norway, content to maim and kill the people of defiant regions. And in this manner, he gained peace in his country by blood and fear. The king would spend quiet hours composing poetry, pondering his own legacy. He may have heard tales of the distant Norsemen who reached North America some decades ago. He himself had journeyed far south as a mercenary. And as king, he explored north into glacial seas beyond the map's edge, realms surely host to wild beasts and ancient monsters. Of his voyages, it was written, "The king finally had to turn back when the extreme limit of the world disappeared in fog before his eyes. He barely escaped the gaping ravine of the abyss." Harald had lived 50 winters, and the days of glorious and terrible war might have seemed but memories to an aging king. Yet one day a traveler came to his court. He was Tostig Godwinson, or an envoy on his behalf. Tostig had until recently ruled in the Kingdom of England as the Earl of Northumbria, but he had been a harsh ruler, and when the people rebelled against him, his rival brother Harald Godwinson succeeded in having him banished. And upon the death of the childless King Edward, the English High Council crowned Harald Godwinson the King of England. The jealous brother Tostig sought retribution, imploring Harald of Norway to conquer the country, to redeem Magnus's old claim to the English throne. Harald Hardrada could become the Viking King of England, and Tostig would regain land and power as his vassal. So Harald prepared an army. In dreams, dark omens came to the King of Norway and his followers. One man saw a great battle in England, and before him a witch riding a wolf. With bloody jaws her beast devoured the carcasses of Harald's men, and she sang, "The troll woman sees clearly the doom awaiting Harald." Grassy cliffs pulled high and quiet over the sea and sloped into little dwellings where people beheld a scowling fleet bearing an army of around 10,000 warriors. Harald and his Vikings buttressed by Tostig and some of his allies. Towns submitted to them readily, and when the village of Skartaborg stood against them, the Vikings tossed burning wood onto their houses and slaughtered the people. The invaders proceeded inland by river, far from the gaze of King Harald Godwinson, who was perched in the south with his army, anticipating an invasion from another claimant to the English crown, William, Duke of Normandy. The Normans themselves were the descendants of Viking raiders, who over a century ago gained land along the French coast, mixing with indigenous Franks and adopting much of their customs. For now, Harald met little resistance as his army neared the great city of York, whose weathered walls and towers were the traces of ancient times, when this country belonged to the shining legions of Rome. The English would not now cower behind its walls. On September 20th, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria led their armies against the Viking horde near the marshlands. The invaders pummeled them wildly, and the corpses of Englishmen were scattered about the wet grass. Survivors fled. York and the whole of Northumbria resolved to surrender. The nobles would be spared violence, but made to guarantee their loyalty by offering their children to be held as hostages by the Vikings. And so on September 25th, Harald took 2/3 of his army, and leaving their mail armor behind due to the hot weather, they marched to the site chosen for the exchange of hostages, Stamford Bridge. A cloud of dust appeared in the distance. Having trekked 200 miles in 4 or 5 days, here was King Harald Godwinson and a great English army. Harald of Norway sent riders to summon the remaining third of his army over an hour's ride away. The English pushed onto the bridge. English chronicles would later tell that when his countrymen had fallen, one Viking held the bridge alone for some time, slaying dozens of English before he was killed. Farther back, Harald Hardrada rode before his army, shouting that though they lacked armor, their hearts were fearless. The men rallied shield to shield in a ring, spears planted forward, archers ready. The English cavalry charged and the Vikings repulsed them. The English infantry then crashed upon the edges, but the line held strong. At length the English retreated, and when the Viking front roared in pursuit, the English turned around to rush the gaps in their ranks. In this bloodied swelter, hewn limbs and heads piled underfoot, and dying screams rang out. Harald of Norway took up his rageful sword and slashed at his foes. It was said, neither helmet nor armor could withstand him, and all who were nearest gave way before him. And then an arrow struck through his throat, and King Harald Sigurdsson fell dead. His men did not surrender. Of them it was written, the gallant men who saw him fall would take no quarter, one and all, resolved to die with their loved king around his corpse in a corpse ring. The late arrival of reinforcements did not shift the tide of battle. Tostig was found dead with an arrow through his eye, and only a handful of ships loaded with shaken survivors would make the journey home to Norway. The English tended to their wounds and gathered the dead. It seemed King Harald Godwinson had saved England, yet 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded with thousands of mighty warriors. The king hastened south with some of his army, and at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans vanquished the weary English. Harald Godwinson was killed, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. William would cast out the old aristocracy, massacre rebels, and put himself on the throne. Now came the days of a new line of kings, a new age in England. The power of the crown was strengthened. Warfare would change, as hundreds of grand castles rarely seen before in this land were raised. England would grow closer to continental Europe, and more close to the depredations of Scandinavia. Svein would twice attempt Danish invasions of England and fail. And the body of King Harald Hardrada was returned to Norway, and the throne passed to his sons. He would be remembered in song and saga as cruel and avaricious, and adventurous, wise, and valiant. The last howl of a dark, brave, and wild age. So History Dose is just two people, me, Chris, and my brother Joe, the one painting this. What you just watched is literally hundreds of hours of work between us, researching, writing, editing, and manually creating historically informed art. While we rely on the whims of YouTube to bring in viewers, if you want to keep this channel alive and access History Dose content not available anywhere else, become a member of the Patreon for as little as $1. Perks include access to our Discord, bonus videos released after every episode, the ability to vote on new topics, and much more. Link is in the description. Thanks.